Well, welcome everyone to the 13th episode of our series, Ideas and Lives, in which we interview people who've had very interesting lives and compelling ideas. Today, we're particularly pleased to have our first Nobel Prize winning interviewee and a very good friend of Tzvi Bodie's, who's my co-host. And Tzvi, take it away.
All right. Well, let's not make it a secret. It's Sheldon Glashow. 1979 was the year, and physics was the field. So I'm going to start. So welcome, Sheldon.
Pleasure to be here, Tzvi. And Bob.
And how did you become interested in physics? Let's start with that.
Well, that's a long story, of course, and it began when I was a child, perhaps at the age of 13 or so. It had to do in part with science fiction, which I fell in love with at a young age. I used to have a collection of astounding science fiction going back to 1943 or 44, when I was only 11 or so. Used to be an inexpensive magazine that you could buy at the candy store. Also things like thrilling wonder stories. Things like that got me into science. Also, the Second World War, because airplanes became very important, and I was curious to understand how planes fly and how they attack one another or drop bombs, things of that kind. That sort of stuff was fascinating to a youngster. In fact, years later, when I was called upon to, as a member of ROTC in college, I was asked to explain to the more serious cadets how airplanes fly, which is something I barely knew, which in fact people today barely understand.
Yeah, they misunderstand, right?
Anyway, so I was always interested in science, and then when I went to junior high school, I took the trouble in preparation for this encounter today to look at my junior high school yearbook.
Oh,
Where various my co-graduates, if you can call them that, at the age of 14 or 15, wrote little notes to one another, and I noticed that two of them compared me with Pasteur. And two of them to Einstein. So it was a tie between Pasteur and Einstein. And there were all kinds of comments suggesting, I wrote a couple down just out of curiosity. A great man of science was found in 9BR. The only person in 9BR who knows over 80 elements.
This is what they wrote in the yearbook or something?
Yes. Here's hoping that you will always know as much science as you know now, etc., etc. So,
well, that's so, and this was when you were 15.
This was when I was 15, right?
All right. Okay, it started early.
14 and a half. It started early. So that, I think, answers that question. Why, of course, in those days, it was just science, which is why I get compared with Pasteur. There was no distinction. I think one of the things even compares me with Madame Curie, but which is chemistry and not my discipline at all. It got serious when I got to high school, because there, many of my friends in high school were committed to physics as a career. And when I went to Cornell, for example, about 5 of us from Cornell from Bronx High School of Science went to Cornell to study physics.
Yeah, that we should say that you went to Bronx High School of Science, which for viewers who don't know is probably, I don't know, the best public high school in the country.
It was then. I'm not sure it still is, but yes, it did focus on science, and most importantly, its science education was not all that great, but it brought together talented kids who were interested in science.
Right, it was an exam school. You had to
The most
pass.
important thing was the gathering of these people who, many of whom were important to me. For example, one kid taught me calculus in the lunchroom sometime in my junior year. There were no courses in calculus at that time. The most advanced math that I was able to take was solid geometry, which was very advanced, but it wasn't calculus. So calculus I had to learn more or less from this kid who became a professor at City University later on.
All right. Next question.
Just
As simply as you can. Yeah,
I have to pause it a second because
Yes?
what's the problem? Whoops.
no, we'll just continue.
Here we go. Okay, we're up to the following question. Can you tell us what you won the prize for?
Yes, I can tell you, but let me start. Let me make it into a story. So when I went first to graduate school, I learned that there are 4 forces in nature, and they are gravity, electrodynamics, electromagnetism. That's 2. And then there were 2 nuclear forces called the strong nuclear force and the weak nuclear force, which I'll abbreviate to call the strong force and the weak force. Historically, there had been several attempts to combine these forces together. The most famous, or I should say notorious of which, was Einstein, who wasted the last decades of his life, and I literally mean wasted, by ignoring the new discoveries that were being taken place in the realm of atomic or nuclear physics. And he focused on putting together, unsuccessfully as it turned out, the electromagnetic force and the force of gravity. By the way, the very word electromagnetism refers to an earlier unification of forces by Maxwell of the electric forces and the magnetic forces, 2 seemingly disparate things that were eventually realized to be linked together and to be part of the same thing. Well, anyway, Einstein failed at that, and Yukawa, the great Japanese physicist who predicted the existence of mesons to mediate nuclear forces, believed that these same hypothetical particles could also mediate the weak force. So he was attempting to unify the 2 nuclear forces, the strong and the weak. But that didn't work either. So what I did is I realized the suggestion by my thesis advisor, Julian Schwinger, who told me in classes and personally that there are several common features shared by the weak nuclear force and electromagnetism, and it seemed plausible that they could be united with one another. And so he gave me that challenge as a graduate student. So that's how I became interested in tying together the weak and electromagnetic forces. And in fact, for a paper I wrote a year or 2 after graduating from Harvard and getting my PhD, that paper was the basis for my Nobel Prize, which would happen a decade or so later.
So it was really early on in your career as an academic theoretical physicist
It
that
was
you.
early in my career that I did the work that would justify the Nobel Prize.
Did you realize at the time that it was so pathbreaking?
Not at all. And neither did anyone else. It was a paper that was in a then obscure journal, and not very many people refer to it. And the next key to make this into a sensible theory was provided by my high school classmate, Steve Weinberg, who joined me at Cornell and later at Harvard. And it was Steve Weinberg in 1967 who added the missing ingredient to my unification, for which he would eventually share the Nobel Prize with me. But at that time in 1967, he didn't take his own paper seriously, and nor did anyone else. It waited until certain other developments would take place before there was general recognition of the importance of our work.
And how did that materialize? How did that new attention materialize?
Well, there were two things. The first is that it did not seem that the theory was, as it was created by Weinberg and me, was mathematically consistent. And that would be proven by two Dutch physicists who would, in fact, share the Nobel Prize for proving what was called the renormalizability of what became known as the electroweak theory. So that had to happen. And furthermore, the experimental evidence for the neutral currents that I predicted back in 1960, those were not found until 1972 or 1973. And that was an essential prediction of the theory, which made more people become interested in it.
What was the test of that related to your paper? The test of what you predicted related to your paper?
Yes, neutral, what we'll call neutral currents, as opposed to the charged currents that everyone knew about, had to be present in the weak interactions according to us. And they sure enough were observed in 1973.
Now, the third recipient who shared the prize with you, what was his contribution?
I will tell you, and it's not very flattering to him, even though Abdus Salam remained a good friend of mine, but perhaps should not have. But let me explain. Salam did exactly what I did in my 1960 paper written in Copenhagen. He did exactly what I did in 1964 without referring to me. And he did exactly what Weinberg did in 1967 in 1968. So those are the bases for his winning the Nobel Prize.
So did he work together with Weinberg?
He did write a paper with Weinberg at one time, and so did I, for that matter. But that was not about the unification of weak and electromagnetic interactions. He, however, was very aggressive and very capable of getting responsible parties throughout the world to nominate him for the Nobel Prize.
I see. All right. Well, that's what you got the prize for.
Yep.
Now you've shown great interest in communicating your ideas to non-scientists in a variety of ways, in your teaching and in public speaking. What have you done to educate us? us non-physicists in particular.
Well, you're excluding, by us, you are not counting the thousands of college students that I
Right,
encountered.
right. I'm not,
Other
that's
us's.
it.
Well,
right.
there's a variety of us's I addressed. Some of them were high school students. I've given many, many talks, maybe a dozen, at high schools in Massachusetts. Enthusiastic kids at high school would a friend of mine organized these talks and encouraged me to do them. And the kids were uniformly excited to meet a Nobel Prize winner. They all wanted to feel the medal or be touched by a Nobel Prize winner and have me answer their questions. But also I lectured to them about the nature of science and the role of science in human affairs. So that was fun. I did that in America. I also did it in the Orient, so to speak, that is to say in Japan and in China, where I was invited to give talks to youngsters typically in high school, but sometimes in younger than that. That's another game I played. Then, of course, we'll come to it. I am the editor-in-chief of the Inference International Review of Science, which doesn't communicate with the us, with that us, but with another us, namely the world community of scientists who exist in many forms, and we include economists in that category, for example. As well as archaeologists and a wide variety of people that are not generally regarded as scientists. So those are some aspects in which I have tried to communicate science to others. I have also written articles popular articles in such things as the New York Times, Sunday Magazine, and elsewhere, New Scientist, and places like that.
I
Can't hear you.
I'd like to go back after you had this great success early on in your career. Did you continue working in that general area, or, I mean, presumably all your research continued? Do you want to tell us about that?
Very much so. The work I did in 1960, I did not take very seriously for some years afterward, but I did lots of other things in many fields, some of which I'm very proud of. I'll give a couple of examples. One, in 1964, also in Copenhagen, I was spending a sabbatical, and with a colleague, James Bjorkane, 1964, I should remind you, is the year in which Murray Gell-Mann introduced quarks. He had invented quarks, and he had invented three what we call flavors of quarks, up, down, and strange. And we introduced the fourth quark and introduced its name, the charmed quark. So at that time, for aesthetic reasons, primarily for reasons of symmetry, because there were 4 leptons, which are particles that don't share in the strong force. And so consequently, there ought to be 4 quarks, which are particles that do share in the strong force. 2 doublets of leptons and 2 doublets of quarks, a certain beautiful symmetry. But that became substantially more important a few years later, in 1969, when with an Italian and a Greek collaborator, John Iliopoulos and Luciano Maiani, we showed how this fourth quark could save the electroweak theory and make the theory an experimentally satisfactory theory of the electrical and weak interactions.
And could you prove the existence of the charmed quark?
we could not prove the existence. No theoretical physicist can prove the existence of anything, let alone a new quark.
Right.
But the particle was, evidence for the particle showed up in 1974 when I was awakened by a telephone call from my old friend, Sam Ting, who claimed he and his group had discovered a new particle and he wanted to know what it was. So I drove out to MIT and they lectured me about the particle that they found, and it was very exciting. I did not realize quite yet what it was, but I went over immediately to Harvard, and at Harvard, my colleagues told me about I said I had something exciting to tell them, and they said, no, we have something exciting to tell you. They told me of the new report of a particle found in California that seemed to be the same particle that Sam Ting had found in Long Island. I had an accelerator laboratory there, Brookhaven. And we realized that these two things were the same, and it didn't take us very long to realize that this had to be evidence for the fourth quark, for the charmed quark. Nobody agreed with us. In fact, they disagreed violently, but eventually, within 2 or 3 years, when charmed quarks were directly observed, that people conceded that the charmed quark really did exist. And I was very happy in those years before the charmed quark was seen in the laboratory, when I knew that it would be found. And in fact, after a year or so of their searching for it fruitlessly, I called up a good friend of mine, an experimental physicist in California, and told him that there's a conference coming up soon and he damn well better find the charmed quark for his own sake, if not for mine. And 2 weeks later, he reported the discovery of the charmed quark. So that was something having nothing directly to do immediately with the, as it turned out, the Nobel Prize or anything like that, but that was an accomplishment of which I was very proud.
Yeah, it sounds like that should have gotten a Nobel Prize.
It sounds to me too, and my two colleagues would agree strongly with that.
And how
I have just nominated them for the Wolf Prize, which is a prize of lesser glory but more money than the Nobel Prize. And I sincerely hope that they will win that prize. I can't nominate myself because winners of the Nobel Prize are not eligible by law for the Wolf Prize.
Oh.
So how did you meet and collaborate with an Italian and a Greek scientist?
Okay, well, first I should explain that the Italian is not really an Italian. He's a San Marinan. Those Italians who are born in San Marino are not Italian, are not regarded as Italian, but they are San Marinans. And that's important because that Luciano did not have to serve in the army and waste 2 years of his life before he could become a physicist. And John Iliopoulos, although he is Greek, decided to become French. So today he is French primarily. But I played a role when I was at Harvard in selecting our postdoctoral fellows. We all did that collaboratively, and they were our choices for to hire as postdoctoral fellows. That's how we brought them to Harvard, and it was in Harvard that we did our work together. And both of them have remained quite close friends of mine, and I was hoping next week to go to Paris and meet with John Iliopoulos, but that was canceled because the COVID-19.
Yeah,
when will the Wolf Prize be announced?
Hmm?
When will the Wolf Prize be announced?
I'm not sure, but the nominations just went in as of 3 or 4 weeks ago. So
How often is that prize given?
Every year, but I don't know if it's given for physics every year.
Let's see. By the way, the publication that Sheldon is editor-in-chief of now is called, we said it, but I don't know if everyone got it. It's called Inference Review.
Well, that's just the URL. The name of the
Yeah.
journalist is the Inference International Review of Science. But
Oh, that's
yes,
the full
URL is inference-review.com.
Right.
It's
it's-
.com, although our business plan is not suggestive of a .com thing, because it's free and we have no ads and we do pay our writers. It's
Right.
an interesting business plan.
It does not make profit.
It makes nothing.
Yes.
It makes
It spends money.
Yes. Well,
But
we're funded by an outsider a generous outsider.
And it has some really fascinating articles, I have to say.
Well,
Now,
now that I've become its editor-in-chief, it should become even better.
that's right. All right, here's my favorite question. Are there any controversies among physicists today? Well, and if so, what are the most important ones?
There are lots of controversies and have been. Sorry. One of my favorite is now resolved. It was called the solar neutrino problem, and it had to do with what neutrinos were first observed, were predicted in 1930 and were first observed in the laboratory in 1953. And a few years later, they were observed coming from the sun. And that was quite a triumph. But the problem was, the good news was they saw neutrinos coming from the sun, and there had to be neutrinos coming from the sun because the sun makes its energy through nuclear fusion, and nuclear fusion necessarily produces neutrinos. So the bad news was there weren't enough. There were only about a third as many neutrinos as my friend and his collaborators, John Bacall, had predicted there to be. And that was quite a puzzle. And it led to a great controversy. Some people believe that the experiment was flawed and had to be repeated, and it was repeated in many ways and turned out to be perfectly correct. The second possibility is that something happens to the neutrinos on their way from the sun to the Earth. And the third explanation was that the theory of nuclear fusion in the sun was flawed, that there was another mechanism different from what we all had thought. And it turned out that the second alternative was true. Something happens to the neutrinos on their way, something perfectly natural, called neutrino oscillations. It turned out that there are 3 different kinds of neutrino, and that they turn into one another, so to speak, as they propagate. So the neutrino oscillations, it was called. And that only got cleared up in the year, roughly 2000, by a brilliant series of experiments, both in Japan and in Canada, and the decisive experiment actually in Canada. So that was a long and wonderful story of a controversy which is no longer a controversy. Today, there are many controversies. There is the question, a wonderful one that I viewed the beginning of, was at a conference sponsored by Werner Erhard. Have either of you ever heard of Werner Erhard? Yes,
but not in this connection.
He was the creator of the Erhard. They were seminars where they would torture people more or less, and well, not really torture them, but subject them to very boring lectures and prevent them from going to the bathroom.
Wasn't it called EST?
Est, yes. So he was well known for that. But what is not so well known is that he was a physics groupie, and he created his foundation, that is, funded a series of 10 conferences, annual conferences, two of which were attended by Stephen Hawking. Some were attended by Richard Feynman, Murray Gell-Mann, other distinguished physicists. And I attended one of them, in fact, one of the ones that Stephen Hawking attended. It may have been when I first met Stephen Hawking. But the important people at that meeting was not me. It was Stephen Hawking and Leonard Susskind, who's a physicist in California at Stanford, and Gerard 't Hooft, who's one of the two Dutchmen who did this wonderful thing and proved the mathematical sensefulness of the electroweak theory. Anyway, those three had the following interaction. The bomb was dropped by Stephen Hawking, who announced at that conference that what was called Hawking radiation, which he had invented in 1974, that Hawking radiation made it possible for information to be lost. And that is to say, the ultimate fate of a black hole is to evaporate and disappear. He had shown that unambiguously. And that's bad news, because if you take, for example, a piano and throw it into a black hole, it's eaten up, it disappears in the black hole, and you've destroyed this piano. And that's destroying information, which doesn't come out, it seemed, in the thermal radiation emerging from the black hole. So that's a paradox, because one of the most blessed conservation laws in all of science is the conservation of information. And we do not believe, that's implicit in quantum mechanics. So it's a choice between believing in Hawking or believing in quantum mechanics. And that was a real controversy, which was basically resolved by the work of Susskind and Gerard 't Hooft, and others, and a South American scientist called Maldacena, who together realized that the universe is a hologram, as the string theorists would say. It's not what we think it is. It's a hologram of a more complex system. Anyway, to many, that resolved the problem. But so others would say it didn't really resolve the paradox. It converted the paradox into an enigma, because who in the world can understand the universe as a hologram? Anyway, that's another controversy, that one which still persists today, because I, for example, am not very happy with the solution to this puzzle that has been presented to us. So yes, there are controversies.
I see. Yeah, I have another one. Your last academic appointment was at Boston University. What did you teach there?
Well, I taught more or less the same things that I had been teaching. At Harvard, before that, I would often teach graduate level courses, but also frequently teach what might be called physics for poets, or more precisely, physics for non-science majors. So I, in fact, wrote a book called From Alchemy to Quarks, which described the history of physics, which I would hope to teach out of, which I didn't actually teach out of, because I found that the book was a little aimed too high. But in any case, I taught this basic physics course for many years at Harvard and also at Boston University. The difference is at Boston University, I no longer had many graduate students when I came to Boston University. In fact, I had only one at BU. And I taught only undergraduates and mostly non-science majors. So I taught the science for poets course for some years at both at Harvard and at BU. But also, more importantly, at BU, I focused on a course on energy for our best students in the honors program, energy and alternative energy sources, climate change, global warming, and all that. So that's what I've been teaching primarily in my last decade at BU. Today, of course, I no longer teach. I've taught enough. I'm still learning, but I'm not teaching.
And you are lecturing.
Sorry? I am
And you are
lecturing
lecturing.
from time to time, but I lecture on more or less historical subjects. I'm not actively doing any research at present.
I'll ask a question
Yeah, go
about,
ahead. You have a couple of questions, Bob.
well, I'll first ask a question stimulated by your last comment about how you feel the media, even some of our better media outlets handle the world of science. From my perspective, many of the things that
You've frozen.
often take some sort of
Yeah, there he goes. Say it again, Bob. You froze.
Do you hear me okay?
Yes.
I was talking, you stimulated my thinking about how you feel the media deals with science these days. It seems as if many issues that you've described in purely scientific terms become almost political controversies. I just read a long article about how did the COVID virus come out? Could it have been a lab?
Oh, well, but that's
And
also
I'm just wondering.
issue. Yeah, that's an important issue. I would agree strongly with that. We don't know is the answer, and we probably never will know whether it was an accident, whether it emerged from a laboratory or from an animal, and that's basically the question.
Well, yeah, but the article that I just read sort of immediately made it into a political question. Not did it emerge from a laboratory or not, but which individuals proposed that it came from a lab and which ones said it couldn't have. And
the ones who said it couldn't have backed down. I mean, that's except for the Chinese, of course. It is an intrinsically political problem because it is a problem that could be resolved if we had certain information from the Chinese. And the Chinese have been unwilling to make that information known. So that's why it is intrinsically and permanently a political issue. But it is a scientific question which we would love to know the answer to. But we cannot know the answer right now.
I'm just wondering whether you've seen any coverage of things. I mean, even the issue of climate change and many other issues where almost if someone takes a moderate position, I'm thinking of this fella Coonan who was at Caltech, has written a book about uncertainty about the exact nature of it, and it becomes very politicized as opposed to
This
dealing
is
with.
very true. The whole climate change issue is politicized. The efficacy of vaccines is politicized by these anti-vaxxers that exist not just in this country, but elsewhere as well, who are infiltrated with faulty information, with false information, who spread false information. And there are, I mean, there are many controversies of that kind. Another, we have no time to go into these things, but there is a GMO controversy, genetically modified organisms, which I feel strongly about. There is a nuclear power controversy, which I feel strongly about. There are many issues out there which are being perverted by today's polarized press. Yes, no question of that. I mean, we can all choose sides, and I know which side I believe in, but neither side is entirely responsible in the world of mass media.
Well, it just seems as if a lot of the controversies that you were speaking about within physics and so on became more politicized over the years.
Well, everything, oh, you froze it again.
It just seems like it's
Let me
taken on
ask
new
you.
course.
Let me ask you the same question in a slightly different way. If you are a left-wing physicist or scientist, how would that bias your science?
Well,
versus the right wing,
not so
or is
much
it
a
not
question.
left or right wing?
Well, what I'm most concerned about is not my own bias. It's the fact that there is today intellectual repression of a sort that has never, in my knowledge, existed in this country before, and it has to do in part with the arguments about disparity, diversity, equity, and inclusion. This has become a sort of religion, and today people who speak their own mind on issues which may or may not be scientific in nature are often criticized or punished for expressing views that do not agree with the DEI religion, the religion of the new third wave of anti-racism that abounds in this country. So I am very fearful of this attack on intellectual honesty, on intellectual freedom. The fact that people are afraid to speak because they may lose their jobs. I'm not afraid.
Well, even to apply for a
I have no
job,
job. Mm-hmm.
even to apply for a job, I think in some universities, even if it's a physics job, you have to state how you're going to handle.
It's worse than that. Even if you apply to a college, most colleges require their potential undergraduates to write an essay on their attitude toward DEI before.
I didn't realize it went that.
It has gone that far.
Yeah. With regard to that, I mean, were you at all surprised by the MIT recent controversy? Maybe you were referring to that, at which the
Yes.
University of Chicago scientist had his lecture at least
Had his lecture
postponed.
canceled, yes, and it was severely criticized. Yes, I very much had that in mind, and Yes,
That was when he was
Many incidents at
uninvited
that
from MIT, right?
it was MIT that did not let him talk.
Right.
No, he was from Chicago, I think. I don't
Yeah.
know. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he was a professor there and argued that merit should be the only way we judge who becomes a faculty member, at least the science faculty member. But
Well, we have one more question for you, and that is, have your views on the teaching of science changed over the years, and where are you now with respect to, let's call it, science literacy?
Yes, well, we in this country, I don't know how things are in other countries, have not progressed very far in terms of scientific literacy. The evidence for this is in the popularity of such anti-scientific sects as those who oppose GMOs, those who oppose nuclear energy, those who feel that Americans have, well, what we were talking about earlier, the politicization of, that's not really a word, but
it is a word. It is a word. Politicization.
Yeah, it's an ugly word for an ugly concept, the politicization of science. It was not like that when I was a student. It was quite the contrary. We were quite apolitical in general, except for opposing unjust wars like Vietnam and marching for women's rights. These are minor political acts, for example, that I engaged in, writing a couple of letters to the New York Times against the Vietnam War, marching. I have with a bunch of women. I would say beautiful women, but I can't say that because that's no longer politically acceptable.
Right.
So yeah, it's changed, but the education of our students are not well educated in science. Our students at Harvard, although I haven't been teaching there for 20 years, it was clear that the non-science students, by and large, knew no science, whereas the science students knew quite a lot about humanities. The science students tend to be well-read and to be interested in art and music and literature, but non-scientists often have a great pride in their lack of knowledge about science or mathematics.
When I was entering my freshman year at Brandeis, they had us read a book by C.P. Snow.
Oh, yes.
Called something about the two
cultures.
And in a way, what you're saying sounds very much in that direction.
That's how it was, and unfortunately, that's how it still is, except in disciplines like economics, which were once far removed from science and today have adopted scientific procedures universally. So that's an example of a discipline that has changed. But in the classics, it's very difficult. Here's a problem that we have, that we want to write an article that links the history of the evolution and development of humankind, which is a partly historical problem, because we are interested in the origin of the slave trade and the behavior of people in ancient times. And there are those who pursue the scientific aspects of this story and those who pursue the social aspects of the story of the evolution of our species. And the social scientists simply don't understand the paleochemistry that is so important today in determining what ancient people ate and how they behaved and what they did. So to get someone to review the subject is almost impossible, because they're either scientists who don't know anything about the social history of people, and the social scientists who know even less about the science. So it's, as an editor, I find it very challenging to find the right people to deal with many subjects.
But the irony is that there are so many, technology has provided so many ways of learning for people to have the motivation. And I mean, the ability to draw.
Yes, we have those. We're learning. We have more and more powerful techniques, but we don't have people who are familiar with the techniques and with the reasons that we are making these investigations. I mean, we're trying to track down the social history of pre-modern times, and that requires a constellation of scientists, and both social scientists and hard scientists.
All right. Well, I think with that, we're going to call it a day. And thank you very much.
I just want to say one thing. I just want to thank you. We hadn't known each other before, and
well, now we know each other.
Amazing pleasure, and not to say fantastic learning experience for me and our listeners. And you know, I personally want to thank you on my behalf for your participation in this.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I hope that these podcasts achieve a suitable currency. So
you'll certainly help it.
We call it the Bob and Svi Show, and we sign off, as we will now, by saying "Sei gesund."
Sei gesund, my friends.
Sei gesund.
Bye-bye.